New Zealand faces a number of different threats from natural hazards, and its approach to civil defence and emergency management, as we call it in New Zealand, is to create resilience in our communities. And we talk about resilience being communities that understand and manage their hazards. The definition of resilience is a bit open. It can be interpreted a number of different ways, but we generally accept in New Zealand that it is about being able to have the capacity and the capability to cope with a stress or a shock to the community. The way it is intended to work is that there is a responsibility in legislation for local government, the city council, district councils, to do all they can to create resilient communities. So we talk about them doing activities which will reduce the risk, activities that make communities ready, communities having the ability to respond and ultimately to recover from whatever the shock or stress is.
So lots of preparation pre-event, both at planning and creating awareness the community and between the decision makers as well.
That's the goal, and it is the role from the central government's perspective, using the Ministry of Civil Defence and Emergency Management to facilitate the creation of activities at the local level and the community level to create either risk reduction or readiness.
Oh, that's great. So let's now talk about the 22nd February Christchurch earthquake. So what was the structure, the response structure there, and what was your role as a national controller?
So on the afternoon of Tuesday, the 22nd of February 2011, at 12:51 actually, 6.2 magnitude earthquake struck Christchurch. Pretty well directly epicenter was directly underneath the city. That caused significant damage in the central business district, a number of deaths through falling masonry, collapsed buildings, 185 deaths in total by the end of the response, as well as a significant amount of liquefaction and damage to residential areas in the eastern part of the city, and as you would imagine, lots of damage to critical infrastructure as well. The initial response was undertaken by the Christchurch City Council, as it is intended in the approach to civil defence and emergency management, and they did a fantastic job under pretty stressful conditions. They worked in conjunction with the emergency services to do the initial response, including trying to recover people from collapsed buildings, to provide centres where people, because it was a working day, could go prior to trying to get home to check on families. The hospital did a fantastic job with triaging casualties and managing casualties and providing the capacity to deal with casualties. It was pretty obvious to central government that afternoon the scale of the impact of the earthquake was considerable, and the government made the decision on Wednesday morning to declare a state of national emergency, which escalates the control and the coordination of the response from local government to a position that is appointed by government called the National Controller. And so I was appointed the National Controller on the morning of Wednesday the 23rd, and then I deployed down to Christchurch to coordinate the response.
So 5 years has gone since that day. What are the most important lessons that you would like to pass on?
5 years on, I've had a lot of time to think about what I could have done, should have done, and what we could have done, should have done prior to a major emergency. Generally fits into two broad categories: preparedness and the use of the concept of resilience. So I'll focus on preparedness first. I guess what we saw in Christchurch was that the basic level of preparedness in households in the community was actually very good. There was an ability for people to work with each other in their community, neighbours and community spirit to make sure that resources that they had were shared. There was a very good structure for the City Council to create a response mechanism to try and coordinate the response. The emergency services, including urban search and rescue, were well prepared and were able to be deployed into the city to assist those that had been trapped in buildings. Some of the critical infrastructure was extremely well prepared. The ones that really stick out for me were the Orion company, which is the retail end of the electricity distribution. Yeah. They had a very good system of understanding where their breakages were, where electricity was still available and where electricity had been cut off. But they were able to triage their system and move into response.
This goes back I guess the culture of preparedness that New Zealand has, and in particular, it would be great if you could talk the lifeline guidelines that the Civil Defence Emergency Management created a long time ago in New Zealand.
I think we have always recognised in New Zealand that our resources available to respond to emergency have always been a bit scarce. It's a small nation, small population, 4.5 million people, small economy. So there's not a huge repository of resources available in an emergency. So we've tried to say to critical infrastructure owners that you have at least a moral obligation to make sure that your system is going to be up and running after an emergency, although it might be operating at a lower level than it would normally routinely be operating. And that is actually enshrined in legislation. So if you're a water provider, or you operate the sewerage system or electricity or telecommunications or the airport or the shipping port, you have an obligation, a legal obligation, to have in place some of the mechanisms which will ensure you can operate after an emergency, even though it might be at a lower level. And in Christchurch, I think that worked extremely well for us.
We talk about things that worked pretty well, and we must be very proud of. What are the things we should have done better?
I think the most significant one for me was that I don't think we had sound enough, robust enough, strong enough connections between the authority, the Civil Defence and Emergency Management Authority, whether it was the City Council or the National Response, and the community that was impacted. I liken this to a hub and spoke, and it should be created prior to the emergency so that when the emergency strikes, there is somebody in the community that you've already had a conversation with about my need from the centre for information about what the impact is, what are the critical needs that the community might have, as opposed to me sitting in the centre or literally having to send people out to go and find out the information. I think you should have that strong connection. I appreciate that the community, and I want the community to use its own initiative and community spirit to put in place activities which will get them going again. And they did in Christchurch, and I applaud them for doing that. But we in the centre didn't know half of the story.
So that should be something done in peacetime, as you were saying, and establishing this sort of connection. Would social media or any other form of communication help this? Building in peacetime and maybe keeping up the communication during emergency and response times.
Oh, I think in the period prior to an emergency, there is all sorts of mechanisms you could use to create that engagement and involvement of the community, and it depends entirely on how the community is structured. It's actually quite hard to define what a community is because most people think of it as a geographical thing, but it's not. It could be faith-based, it could be sports, or it could be around a school or some other activity which is completely separate from geography. Social media is a big issue now. My lesson out of Christchurch is that if you do it that way again, you'll be given a hammering by the public, and by that I mean we monitored social media, but it basically took us 10 hours to respond to someone's post on Facebook or Twitter about an issue, and that's just not good enough. Nowadays, the expectation from the public when they commit something to social media, that there's almost an instantaneous response from the authorities, and so you need to have in place the capacity to be able to monitor social media and quickly flick the information on to somebody who's going to be able to make the decision.
I would like to ask you about all sort of other information managements, like how much would have helped to have maps of infrastructure disruption, and how much visualization could help decision making.
Well, the first point is, information is absolutely critical to being able to coordinate, let alone control a response. In Christchurch on that afternoon, the City Council's Emergency Operations Centre was in a building which could not be used. The City Council's information management system was also hosted in that building, and therefore when we moved to the art gallery, we had no information management system, no geospatial information out of the council's existing GIS available to us. And so as a result, individual elements had their own spatial awareness and graphic display of what they thought they were dealing with, but it was never centralised in the first instance, which makes it very hard for the person responsible for managing the response to be able to, first of all, understand what the impact is, and second, then be able to make the decisions about where resources are best deployed. So there's an answer, probably electronically, but even the electronics of the information management system aren't going to be enough. It's still going to require some intellectual capacity to interpret what that information is telling us.
But could help to have information all stored in the same place and being able to be visualized.
Absolutely,
and overlaid and interrogated and so on.
So the concept is pretty well universal. I think that in an emergency you will expect there to be a emergency operations centre, which is from where the response is coordinated. So the City Council's normal emergency operations centre wasn't available to us because the building had been damaged by the earthquake. But the council was able to use its art gallery, which was within walking distance of the actual EOC. The art gallery, a bit odd doing emergency management amongst some masterpieces, but the art gallery was a modern building, good building structure, some broken glass, but survived very well. A lot of space, a bit disjointed because it had a number of galleries, but it provided sufficient space to run basically the whole operations segment, which included critical infrastructure as well as some community engagement, provided for a planning function, a large area for public information and media management, a lot of area for briefing, particularly engineers who went out to assess buildings and infrastructure. And most critically, it had a functioning cafeteria which provided food and coffee, which sustained people for a long period of time.
Oh, that's great. We talk about the needs for connecting and coordination with the community and community representative. What about coordination and connection with voluntary groups? There were a lot of them operating down in Christchurch. How was the connection established and maintained with
Again, 5 years on, I now know that there were far more community-based, spontaneous organisations popping up than I actually knew on the day. But there were a number of community-based organisations which appeared to meet their needs. The problem for the response controller was that you can't stop them, and you shouldn't stop them, providing they're doing the right thing, and by and large they do. But your challenge is to have the connection with them so that if they come up against a brick wall somewhere or they need some extra resources, they do have somebody that they can come to and say, I need more wheelbarrows. We've run up against a brick wall with some bureaucracy which we need to get through to carry on. And so some of these organisations were have now got a bit of a legion to them in New Zealand. The Students' Volunteer Army is one, which was university students who said, well, there's no university going on, why don't we lend a hand and go and help people out in the eastern suburbs by clearing the debris from liquefaction. They were remarkable initiative, all driven by students themselves, but equally there was people in Littleton based around the time bank concept who basically pulled information which had an idea of all the sorts of skills and resources which are available in this community, and so if you needed a plumber or you needed an electrician, come to here, to the centre, to the time bank, and we will find somebody for you to help it. And there were church groups that put up facilities to provide water and food for those who were struggling.
Do you reckon, or do you know whether this sort of lesson learned about need for maybe coordinating better, communicating better with voluntary group has been taken up now nowadays? How the Civil Defence Emergency Management is doing to improve this?
It's a real challenge for emergency management people. I'm an ex-military guy, so I come with a military flavour to how you manage a response, and I suspect that there are many other people around the world as controllers coordinating the response who come from a hierarchical, disciplined organisation. Well, communities don't operate that way, certainly don't in New Zealand. And so your challenge before the emergency is to empower, give the community the delegated responsibility for understanding that they can create some of these response centres out in the community. But I'm here to help you if you need something, and to form that relationship. So it's like one of those hub and spoke things. I mean, we had some brilliant initiatives in Christchurch. Someone established a mobile laundry, I think it was, who had a trailer with had a generator and a trailer of washing machines. So he was able to go around communities and do people's laundry for them. There was a number of other ones with portable shower units. So initiative to heat the water with gas, I think bottled gas, and to give people the opportunity to have a warm shower, which they otherwise wouldn't have had. I mean, it's brilliant.
That's Kiwi ingenuity that should be spread around the world, probably. Yeah, I'd like to talk now about transitioning from Christchurch City Council management to a Civil Defence Emergency Management Control, and then to the CERA, the Canterbury Earthquake Recovery Authority. So how was this handled, and how easy, how difficult, what are the issues with
it was hard for me to come into Christchurch on the day after the earthquake, and it's a human thing, and I understand it. When an emergency hits you and your community, the human tendency is to say, I can handle this. Even though it's big, it's my emergency and I can handle it. And I've had this conversation with the mayor of the time, Bob Parker, and that's exactly what he thought. It was his city. His city had been damaged. People. And they kind of resented outside assistance in a bureaucratic way. They never resented any international assistance, I might add. That was welcomed with open arms, because that was adding resources to scarce resources in New Zealand. But it's difficult to be kind of superimposed on an existing structure, and you can't stop the operation to reorganise it, because the operation has to continue. And the same thing happens when it goes from, in our case in Christchurch, from response to the recovery bit. And the recovery was managed by the Canterbury Earthquake Recovery Authority, CERA. There is resentment about yet another government department being created in this case, and coming in to manage what Christchurch thought was their recovery. Yeah. But from a central government point of view, the recovery was always going to take a huge amount of support from central government and a huge amount of investment from central government, and it's quite logical that central government would want to be involved in the decision making and be involved in the management of it.
Yeah. Can you sort of talk about the time that the Civil Defence Emergency Management was in charge. When did you start and when your mandate finished?
So the legislation for civil defence and emergency management in New Zealand provides for the government, the central government, to make a declaration of a state of national emergency when they figure it's the scale of the problem is such that it requires centralised control and coordination of all the resources, including international, that may be available. So that's why the National Controller gets appointed. The Controller has the statutory responsibility and power to marshal all the resources from across the country, and it includes the emergency services, the military, not that you command them, but you have access to them and you're able to deploy them, as well as, if necessary, to take up commercial resources and deploy them to Christchurch for, in this case, for use in the response. So those are under provisions in the Civil Defence and Emergency Management Act. And some of the provisions in that Act allow controls to be put in place around the use of buildings, around having access to some of those resources, transportation resources in the main. But currently, those powers stop when the National Declaration is lifted. So we had to keep the National Declaration on until we had replacement legislation passed, which allowed the provisions to transition through into recovery. So you could argue that the state of national emergency was probably kept on for too long. It was still in place at the end of April. I think in the future, if we can draft revised legislation, that period should be shortened.
Okay. So now, talking about resilience, so what your experience? So does resilience work? Is it really a real concept?
Yes, it's a real concept. I'm a believer in it. I think it's an attractive concept for communities to aim for. We want to have a resilient community, and people understand, I think, intuitively what resilience looks like. Certainly in the natural hazard space, probably a little bit harder for them to grasp in the social and the economic setting. The challenge, though, I think there are probably two bits to it. The first is you can't assume that your communities have resilience. We were lucky in Christchurch. We had an innate level of resilience which worked well for us. But not all communities are going to be like that. And even if you thought that it was there, don't stop trying to build it even more. And so that's why I think the lessons from Christchurch are very important, certainly to other cities in New Zealand, which arguably have even greater threats than what Christchurch faced on the 22nd, and who can apply some of the lessons from Christchurch to make sure that their cities are more resilient tomorrow than they are today.
What about international connections? So you mentioned about people coming in Christchurch and helping. Is there any sort of connection between the Civil Defence Emergency Management New Zealand one with other international similar organizations to sort of work together, join learnings or...
Yeah, so Civil Defence and Emergency Management in New Zealand has two standing agreements, if you like, with their counterparts in Australia and in the US. Those are the only two agreements which says we'll give you a call on the day and discuss what can be done. And on the day, certainly those calls took place with Australia, being our nearest supporter, and they resulted in a very swift deployment of urban search and rescue teams from Australia to New Zealand. But I have also been involved with wider Pacific regional Civil Defence and Emergency Management Forum through UNISDR, through OCHA, through APEC, through ASEAN. So there are lots of connections, and through those connections, whether it's from Civil Defence Emergency Management or Urban Search and Rescue, and lots of other official bilateral connections, we were able to marshal a significant amount of assistance to come to Christchurch.
Yeah, that's fantastic to hear, and that's about really managing the emergency and the response. What about preparedness? Do you think something can be done together internationally, sharing learnings, how maybe in New Zealand you are building resilience within communities here, and maybe comparing best practices, if you like, about doing something similar overseas.
And since the earthquake in Christchurch, and my part as the National Controller, I have provided briefings and material to a number of those international forums. I do treat it with a bit of caution though, and the caution really is that whatever worked for us in Christchurch doesn't necessarily mean that it can be superimposed in some other community and expected to work in the same way, because I don't think it always will. But if you do a bit of beach combing, as we call it, you should be able to delve down to the lessons and say, actually, that is a lesson that could apply to me. So social media is a classic. If we had had the capacity to monitor social media in Christchurch in 2011, we would have been much better at it. We got off by the skin of our teeth, luckily. If we had better system for cleaning out the water supply, we would have been able to implement it. So there are all sorts of aspects which could be applied. The other one I think you've got to be really careful about, though, is that the makeup of society and society's attitude to civil defence and emergency management, in particular the authority in charge of civil defence and emergency management and a response, needs to be taken into account. So Kiwis are fairly laconic and would probably give you a couple of signals with their fingers if they thought that they didn't trust the organisation. Other nationalities, other communities do it differently.
Yeah. How important was pre-earthquake planning for building capacity and capabilities?
I think what I learnt was that probably 90% of the staff who were operating in the Emergency Operations Centre are basically volunteers. Doing an emergency response is their secondary function. They might have been in community development in the council and had no experience of civil defence and emergency management prior to. That suggests that if you are going to have to use volunteers, and pretty well everybody does, then you better have a very good structure through which you do problem solving and planning and tasking of the resources that you have available. Otherwise it'll be very ad hoc and you might miss some of the critical bits, and your operation might be slightly askew of where the needs really are. I don't think we had the capacity to do the planning properly, and I don't think I know we didn't have the structures and the intellectual underpinning which allows you to do strategy through to task.
Do you think what was a problem? The problem was the resources, or really resources constraint, or what do you think was the key issue, and how you are sort of?
Oh, I think the key issue was some sort of educational or guideline for how people go about solving the problem. We were never short of willingness. We were never short of initiative. What you had to do, though, was trying to harness that initiative and willingness and direct it in a way which was going to make a difference to the people who had been affected. The classic ones, which I've used, and I probably should stop using it, is the issue about providing for alternative toilet arrangements in the residential areas. Everybody knew what the problem was. The sewage system wasn't working. We needed a toilet. Well, if you think about it, it's relatively easy to figure out how many portable toilets should be deployed in a street on assumptions. And it's not going to be, it's not going to be one a house, but it could be. Well, it might be one per 5 houses. Well, then you would expect also it to be relatively easy to say to the guys who had a truckload of toilets to say, rightio, here's your street, one per house. How was it then that, having given that sort of instruction, that you get this awful feedback from the community and say, there's not one outside my place. Well, I don't know. Somewhere in the planning and the execution, it didn't work, and it causes grief. Another key lesson for me was that all the work that New Zealand has put into devising a building code and some basic preparations in the household paid off. Yes, sadly, we lost 185 people in Christchurch, and yes, sadly, 2 large commercial buildings collapsed and killed the majority, 115 in one of those buildings. But the other side of the coin is that there was nobody who lost their life to a collapsed residential building. There were 2 infants who sadly were killed when I think a television in one case and a bookcase in another collapsed on top of them, wasn't tied down. But nobody lost their lives to a collapsed residential building, and that says volumes about our building code and the style of construction we have in residential houses. And I'd like to think that we can build on that, and they have. We've looked at the building codes again as a lesson out of Christchurch. We've looked at the policy for looking into earthquake-prone buildings and what can be done to mitigate some of the threats that dangerous buildings represent.
I would like to discuss about decision support tool. Do you think are important? To what extent are they important for supporting decision-making process in emergency time and maybe also in peacetime for supporting preparation and creation of awareness between communities?
I know when we don't have one, it's really difficult. And in Christchurch, we didn't have any decision support or any emergency management information systems. We did scramble together a GIS system which was of some assistance, but most of it is about being able to capture information that comes in from all sorts of sources. We had satellite imagery, we had LiDAR survey information, we had personal reports, we had the infrastructural people, particularly electricity and water and sewage, depicting what the problem was, but we had no way of showing it in one centralised, known
tool
picture,
or, yes,
even though it may be in layers. I think that's critical to it, and Civil Defence in New Zealand now has introduced an emergency management information system. We have yet to have, thankfully, an emergency of the scale of Christchurch to test it. But we do have a system which can have information fed in from the local government level and be seen at central government level.
Yeah. That's a very critical and important lessons for
there
New
is a
Zealand
caution,
and I think for the world as well.
Yeah, but I think there is a caution, and the caution is you can have all the electronic machinery available to you, but it won't make the decisions.
No.
Somebody's got to interpret the information assisted by the information machinery itself, but ultimately the decision is probably a human thing, and judgment, experience, expertise, advice, science, yeah.
And communication and connection, as we said.